So a follow-up video on it is for these with the vacuum port. So when the throttle is closed on the right-hand carburetor, a vacuum is applied only when it's closed, because you have no vacuum when the throttle's open, because when the throttle's open, it's breathing freely with no vacuum. Only when the throttle's closed is vacuum applied to this port right here. That port is on the back side of the diaphragm. So when you're off the throttle and the engine's still ripping, you're only feeding it gas off of the pilot circuit. So eventually you'll have deceleration backfires because the gasoline will get so hot. Well, the combustion temperatures will get so hot that the minimal amount of gas you're giving it through the pilot circuit will create explosions with the exhaust valves open, aka a backfire or deceleration backfire. So what the enrichment valve does is once vacuum is applied when the throttle is off, vacuum is applied to the back side of the diaphragm, and there's a spring in there to overcome that force. Once the valve is opened, it opens the port from this side. So it's filtered air is allowed to go up through here, and then it enriches this and this circuit by allowing more air to flow through, aka picking up more fuel and enriching the cylinder at idle. The problem with some of these carbs is that when you get carb bodies that look like this, sorry for the mess here, but just getting started for the season on like the old GL carbs or a lot of the Hondas that have the enrichment built into the side of the carburetor. When the bore of that wears out, or when the bore of this guy wears out and a leak occurs, be it between vacuum that the diaphragm gets ripped and vacuum is applied to these guys, because vacuum's not meant to be applied to these. It is the fresh air charge that comes from the back, from the airbox side. When this guy's opens, it links this hose to these two hoses. This one runs to that carb. This one obviously runs to right here. Well, a tear in the diaphragm is no good because you're going to have vacuum problems and a straight up vacuum leak on one cylinder when they tear. But if the bore of that pintle right here lets air go past and this doesn't shut off, and these two are naturally linked together, even though the spring is holding this guy closed, the trick is put an O-ring right here. Come on, focus. Put an O-ring at the base here. Now you're not relying on that pintle of this to do the sealing inside the hole. You'll see yours will have chafing wear or a wear pattern on it. But now when that spring pushes this guy closed, these two cannot be linked together. Well, these three. The two outlets and the one inlet will never be linked together. So that's where you add the O-ring, is right there. Now, high idles can be caused by a lot of things. Don't get me wrong. If you have a leak between here and the cylinder head, aka a vacuum leak, you're going to have a hard time getting it to idle as well, is because that leak will change. The more the throttle's closed, the more vacuum is built up in that intake tube, and you're going to end up having a leak in there. So to test that, spray it with carb cleaner. If your engine idles up or dies, you got a leak somewhere. You should be able to spray carburetor cleaner, not on this side, obviously, airbox side, but if your boots are completely sealed, you shouldn't get a rise or a fall out of the engine. But this is what I've found has been problematic with a lot of the older Hondas. So you can't have a torn diaphragm, and put an O-ring at the base of this so that it's closed and you're not relying on the pintle to do the sealing in these bores, because you can't buy these anymore. I don't know if you could have bought them or not. Don't quote me on that, but I can't remember. But the ones that are built into the side of the body, well, that's a whole carburetor, and we all know how expensive that gets. So add an O-ring and then get that to be sealed no matter what. Something else that'll cause you a problem is float height. Carb float height, not the carbs from the Ninjas. That's not from that bike, but the principle's the same, is that when you set float height, every manufacturer has a recommended float height. They want you to measure from here to here. They want you to tip the carb at a certain angle till it lightly seats. Well, the point is that off of this post right here, it'll be 90 degrees. It'll be like that. And it better be able to do it weight down, upside down, because if the needle can't support the float and it looks like that, well, when it's right side up, it's going to overfill. Fuel should never be above this seam. When you put the bowl on, gas should never be higher than that. So you shouldn't have a seam leak. If you have a seam leak or leaking around the seam of the bowl, you got too much gas in there. So you take and you remove the screw and you put a hose on it and then let fuel flow into the carb. Wherever the fuel is in the hose is equal to what's inside the bowl. That's how you double check float height, but 99% of the time is that float height is going to get you 90 degrees. With the needle in there, resting all on its own, will give you a 90-degree corner. Bend it so that it's close. A little tick higher is a little bit better, but then you might be, it's not right. 90 degrees is the best, but a tick higher will assure that you don't have too much fuel in the bowl. Because the problem with too much fuel in the bowl is when the carb's on the bike and it overflows, instead of going through the jets and being picked up by the airflow, you will just have unmetered amount of fuel dumping in the venturi. The bike will run fine, wide open throttle, because it can use that fuel, but what it can't do is use it at idle, because it'll overfill far enough to maybe not puke it on the ground, but it'll just puke it in the bore of the venturi, and then you end up with overflowing carbs internally, which will cause an idle issue, because at idle, it ain't going to want that much fuel. Hope that helps.